Welcome everyone to our final event of Generation Analog 2022. Our second keynote will be Jennifer Kretchmer, television producer, writer, director, and performer. And she will be discussing accessibility in gaming. I forgot to mention this earlier. For those of you who need this information, I am a white woman with short hair wearing glasses. Without further ado, Jennifer, please, we're so excited to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here. Yes, my name is Jennifer Kretchmer. I am a white femme person with red hair. I'm wearing a black shirt with kind of lacy short sleeves and sitting in a gaming chair in front of a magical forest backdrop. I'm starting out today with a self-description, which is something that is common in disability spaces and accessibility circles. Which has unexpectedly in the last 48 hours become very laden with political posturing and snark in the mainstream. For clarity, a self-description is a brief visual description which permits the equitable participation of blind and low vision participants, many of whom either have some degree of sight and or color perception or who have acquired their disabilities later in life and still use visual descriptors as a touchstone. Equitable information, whether it's from descriptions and alt text on images, captioning, or audio description on videos, or other mechanisms of translating or transmitting sensory information that would not otherwise be accessible to an audience, is part of providing equal access and equity of experience. I also want to begin with a land acknowledgement. I am speaking from the traditional ancestral lands of the Chumash, Tongva, and Fernandinho Tataviam, apologies, I have nerves, people, and I honor with gratitude their sovereignty and their stewardship, and I aspire to uphold my responsibilities according to their example. Thank you all so much for having me here today. In particular, I would like to thank everyone who helped to organize this incredible event. In particular, thank you all so much also for ensuring that we have captioning and interpretation for this conversation. A couple of quick accessibility notes. This conversation is being auto-captioned through Zoom and interpreted into ASL. Hopefully we can get an accessible transcript available after the fact, and I have put some definitions into the Discord. I'm hoping to get some slides available after the fact. Unfortunately, I was not able to get them out before this conversation, but I will make sure it gets to the team so we can get them out to everyone. And in terms of content notes, this is a conversation that will be discussing ableism, including ableist slurs and tropes, as well as other forms of bigotry. These discussions may include mentions of relevant topics in disability justice discourse, including medical and institutional trauma, sexual violence, COVID-19, and eugenics. Okay, disclaimer's over. So I am an author. I have worked on Candlekeep Mysteries for Dungeons and Dragons, where I created the first wheelchair accessible adventure for D&D. I have also written for Starfinder and Haunted West. I'm a disability consultant. I've worked on a number of projects, including the Magic the Gathering television show and with Skybound Games for the Walking Dead franchise. We just published the Clementine graphic novel.
Slow down just a little bit.
Sorry, absolutely. I've worked for Skybound Games on the Walking Dead series, and we just published the Clementine graphic novel, which I'm very proud of. And I come out of television and film, but most of my work now is in tabletop RPGs, whether it's as a performer or as a designer and author and consultant. I've been playing tabletop RPGs for more than 20 years. I started during high school and played all throughout my time at Northwestern and UC Berkeley, where I majored in English literature, but I also did disability studies work. It seemed unlikely that those things would be directly practical to my life in terms of a career, but go figure. This is now what I do full time, and all of that is part of my everyday job. As social media began to change with YouTube streaming, social media created new ways for people to connect and for stories to be told. And I fell in with a group of geeks in LA And through a combination of my experience with games, performing, and creating stories for the screen, I began branching more and more into game design and content creation. In the early days of stream tabletop content, there were not a lot of non-men who were involved, particularly non-men who were interested in DMing or game design in any sort of visible roles. So I had a number of people telling me that the work I was doing was important in that way, and that kept me going with it. As I began speaking more and more about my experiences with disability, that only increased, and I felt more strongly about the need to be vocal about those experiences. For people who have only seen me from here up and aren't familiar with my other work, people can be surprised when I disclose my disability. I have a few, including Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder. It means that I have wonky collagen. I have hypermobility, joint dislocations, chronic pain and fatigue, and then a number of related conditions. I also have ADHD and deal with depression and a few other fun brain and body adventures. My conditions are largely invisible unless I'm wearing braces or using mobility devices. I call myself the riddle of the Sphinx because sometimes I'm on two legs, sometimes I'm on two and a cane, and sometimes I'm on wheels. I am an ambulatory wheelchair user. We do exist. One of the things I really want to drive home today is that disability is not binary. It is always a spectrum, and every individual has a unique experience of disability and identity. So I think before I go any further, it's important to talk a little bit about the terminology that I'm going to use for myself and around disability. It's so important to note that the disabled community is not a monolith. Each person has a unique set of experiences, manifestations of their disability, intersections of identity, and so on and so forth. Even within the community, there is constant discussion about the language that we use to refer to ourselves and how it is constantly evolving. For me, and for many members of the community who work in disability justice spaces, we prefer to use identity-first language rather than first-person language. So identity-first language is saying, I am disabled, rather than saying, I am a disabled person. For me, the default assumption should be that I am a person. Disability is part of every moment of my life. It's not something that I can divest from myself. I can't leave it at home when I go to the store. Not that I've been going to the store much in the current world, but it can't be disentangled from my existence. The disabled community is incredibly important to me, and disability culture has been foundational in my framework for navigating everything from equity to conceptualizing the failures of the term laziness, which has been a challenging reframing for someone like me, who's a perfectionist who chronically takes on vastly too many projects. I also use the term non-disabled for people who are not disabled, which centers and normalizes disability rather than framing an idea around a normative body. I'll talk in a bit about models of disability when we get to that part of this conversation. But I prefer to center disability as a normalized experience. If you live long enough, you will at some point become disabled. Some people in the community prefer to use the term pre-disabled for people who are non-disabled. And my friend Christine Bruno likes to say, we are the only club that anyone can join at any time. We are also the largest minority. I primarily will be speaking about the US because that is where my experience and expertise tends to lie, but many of these things are broader spectrum to the rest of the world. But the disabled community spans all other marginalized communities. So all other marginalized issues are disabled issues and vice versa. I will get into that a bit later as we talk about those intersections. But disability and racism, sexism, reproductive rights, queer rights are all deeply entangled, and justice is justice at its core. So I think those are things that really are central to this conversation. You cannot separate these communities, and multiply marginalized folks have unique experiences that are multiplicative, not independent of one another in terms of their identities. I'm operating with Talila Lewis's 2022 working definition of ableism, which I have put in the Discord, which is continuously updated. TL defines ableism as, and I quote, a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression leads to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth or living place, health slash wellness, in quotes, and or their ability to satisfactorily produce, excel, in quotes, and behave, in quotes. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. So I think that's a really comprehensive definition that I have found is pretty, it basically covers most things we need to cover in this discussion when we're talking specifically about ableism. To deconstruct things even further, let's talk about the actual definition of disability. I think the simplest way to define it here is to use the ADA definition, the Americans with Disabilities Act definition. And again, this is mostly through a US lens, but there are reasons that I am working with this particular definition rather than others, which is, quote, a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, a person who has a history or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. So one of the key elements of this is the idea of perception. I'm going to jump ahead, I think, a little in terms of talking about models of disability. And apologies for a loud street. There was a loud car noise if it didn't come through. Historically, disability is highly medicalized. So there's something called the medical model of disability. This is a framework that talks about the idea of a normative body, that if something is, that a disability is a deficit, it's something that needs to be fixed, cured, something is wrong, that the issue is with the individual, not with the way they are perceived. Now, there are definitely flaws to this, to all of the models we'll discuss, but in particular, one of the big gaps in the medical model is that it doesn't allow for perception of the individual. And it doesn't allow for the idea that the behavior of a society is disabling to an individual rather than the person's existence, being the problem. So the medical model says there's a normative human body. There is this proto body. There's an body that is what a human should be. So as we get into talking about, science fiction and cyberpunk, that's where things kind of get sticky with the medical model. The model that I think has been the most formative for the disability justice movement is what's called the social model of disability. This model posits that when you have a plethora of different bodies and brains, there is diversity within that. You're going to have a variety of, you know, heights and hair colors and skin colors and shapes and sizes. That is normal. And that also includes different types of bodies and different types of brains. It's not that something is wrong. It is not something that is an issue with the individual, but it recognizes that society is an issue, that if you're not creating accessible spaces, the access is the problem. That if you have a society that is creating spaces that are inclusive and giving equity of experience and opportunity to individuals, that is no longer disabling. That is equal participation in society. So if you think about an accessibility device like glasses, which have been very normalized in our society, and they are an accessibility device, that is something that is not generally considered a disability in the same way that a wheelchair user would be considered using an accessibility device and being immediately recognized as disabled, because there is not an equity of opportunity and access for those two individuals. So there's a lot of nuance to it, and certainly the social model is not perfect. There are a lot of other models as well. There's a religious model that has implications of morality, which is relevant when we talk about villainy down the line. I promise these will pay off. But those sorts of things, the charity model, which you know depicts disabled people as objects of pity, these are all different models, and all of them have imperfections in terms of what they can cover, but there are some of them have aspects that are, I think, more valuable in terms of the conversations that we have in disability justice circles. The final thing I want to talk about is the term accessibility, which is I'm using the Ford Foundation Disability Inclusion definition. They have a toolkit that is about accessibility in event spaces, whether it's virtual or in person. I highly recommend it. I will make sure that I send out a link to that as well. But the definition there is accessibility is a term to discuss providing tools to allow disabled people equal access to their community, activities, and services. These should never be seen as, quote, benefits, only as leveling tools. Society has created environments that are standardized to societal beliefs that human beings have averages and should only be structured to meet a quote, average person's needs. So accessibility is creating equity of opportunity. It's important to remember accessibility is a right. It's not a favor. It's not a gift. It's not special privileges. The term special in general is a sticky one in disability circles, but anything that's euphemizing is not only dismissing the actual obstacles that disabled communities face historically and societally, but also can create thorny legal situations and deny people their legal rights for access. So terms are complicated. But okay, so we now have definitions to work with here of ableism, of disability, and of accessibility. So let's get back to games. About 7 years ago, I started to get interested in the idea of depicting disability in tabletop gaming, because there wasn't any real depiction of disability. I created a survey because I had started to do design on mobility devices for games, guide familiars, and other sorts of accessible resources to put into tabletop gaming. So I put out a survey because I was curious what disabled players felt was missing. And I got an overwhelming response to the survey. And I ended up reaching out to Wizards of the Coast to offer up the information I found, because I felt like it was so valuable and so important that it needed to be shared, because there was no accessible material. There weren't, there just was no sense of disability in games other than as a purely negative justification for villainy, punishment, curse. There was no sense of identity, and it was pretty clear that there wasn't any sort of there just hadn't been a lot of awareness of it. So this led to a long series of conversations. I was working on some other projects, and I ended up doing a few projects, in partnership with them. And eventually that led to Candlekeep Mysteries, which was really exciting. That was a book with multiple disabled authors on it, but the pushback was extreme. It was a month and a half straight of nonstop harassment as soon as we announced the adventure. And in reality, in practicality, disability was a fairly minor element of my adventure. The accessibility of my adventure, the ramps weren't the central focus. I really had been trying to pull in things that I felt like had been missing from, people wanted to get off of the Sword Coast, for example. And so I went and found a location off of the Sword Coast and was trying to create an adventure where it just happened to be accessible. This wasn't novel. There had been precedent for the Dungeon Master's Guide having references to Yuan-Ti, that's Y-U-A-N-T-I, having their own temples that had ramps instead of stairs because they don't have legs. But it was seen as this very political act to include accessibility, because there was an idea that an adventurer had to be of this certain medical model, normative body, which, if you look at the tradition of tabletop games, has generally been cisgender, heterosexual, white, male, non-disabled, no question. So anything that deviated from that was seen as this strongly political statement, but the reality is that was just someone different than that identity having an opportunity to create spaces where we could exist in these fantasy realms. I also created a few other tools and resources because I felt like this space was missing so much, and there weren't many opportunities, and there wasn't much awareness of the disabled community in tabletop games. So I created the Accessibility in Gaming Resource Guide, which is a whole long list of links to information about disability, about language, about tropes, about world building, about how to have an accessible table and play space, and just created that and published it. That then led to creating the Disabled Creators in Tabletop directory, which I currently have over 250, I believe, people in it in more than 40 different positions. So when people are creating content and they want disabled creators involved in the process, they can reach out to me and we can get a list of creators. And not only can we just get a list of disabled creators who fit the job description they want, but we can also cross-reference for multiply marginalized disabled creators. So that provides additional resources. And that's all, it's all self-disclosure. So it's completely up to anyone who has added their name to the listing, what information they choose to disclose. And then the most recent one is we also created a disabled vendors in tabletop directory. So dice makers, prop makers, anyone who's creating physical, tangible items and having marketplaces. So that's a newer directory. I only put that out a few weeks ago. So that's something we're building toward. But again, there are so many people involved in this hobby. who are creating and identify as disabled and have not had opportunities to put their information out there. And people just didn't recognize that we were part of this community and that we were such a huge part of this community. So that is both astonishing and not at all surprising. I'm going to throw out some numbers here that a lot of people find to be a bit startling. In the US, prior to the pandemic, 26% of the population was disabled. Since the pandemic, that number has only gone up. If we want to talk about financial capital, we have 391 billion with a capital B dollars in disposable income. Disabled communities are very brand loyal. So in terms of if you want to talk on a purely capitalistic level, there's money to be made there and people just still ignore these communities. But you're looking at more than 1 in 4 people in our population. And yet, people don't recognize that prevalence. So, as I was thinking about this conversation, I kept coming back to this idea of embodiment. And certainly when you're talking about disability, the body is a very complex relationship, and the body-mind. But it's not necessarily the acrimonious relationship that many non-disabled people assume, but it is certainly a negotiation at times. But as I thought about this more and more, 3 distinct concepts came into focus for me. The first of which is who is allowed at the table. What bodies are permitted into the play space? Who is given access to even be present? The second was who is permitted into these imaginary worlds, which characters, which NPCs, what navigable systems, and what stories are permitted to exist in these fantastic and collected imaginings. And the third was who is allowed to create. Which voices, bodies, brains, and experiences are permitted to shape the ways in which we tell these stories, the resources that are provided to negotiate the meta of these universes and systems, and then how do these reflect the lived experiences of real people in the real world? So, who is allowed at the table? To even begin to approach this, there are a few requirements. The first is physical access. There are also issues of social access, content access, financial access, and educational and skills access, among others. Each of these have their own numerous implications, but within the framework of disabled history, those contrasts become even more stark. So starting with physical access, part of the reason people don't recognize the prevalence of disability has to do with our historical exclusion. One of the more appalling precedents that exists in our history are the ugly laws, which are a set of laws that were on the books from the mid-1800s until 1974. So that's very recent in the US. These laws made it a crime for people who had any sort of what was considered a deviant brain or body to appear in public. It was punishable from anything from fines to imprisonment. And these also had substantial overlap, in particular with racism. They were used, especially with the Chinese community, as a way to prevent any sort of marriage or childbearing. So again, you know, all of these marginalizations intersect in very complex ways, but they are all interrelated. An example is the ugly law that was on the books in San Francisco in 1867. Any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or deformed in any way so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object to expose himself or herself to public view. So this included anything that would indicate a disability or disease, including insanity, quote unquote. It also criminalized poverty, because that was the unsightly So people who did not have access to hygiene tools were included in this. There were exceptions to this, specifically for freak shows. So it was putting disabled bodies on display for entertainment or for disgust. But it prevented interaction with the general population. And it was a eugenics, it was policies to create eugenics. It was to prevent disabled people from continuing to exist and from continuing to have children and marry. At that same time, and continuing on to this day, institutionalization segregated the population from community. Families would hide their disabled members away. This is the Jane Eyre Woman in the Attic. This is all sorts of precedent. In the 70s, Willowbrook was an expose that happened where there was video footage of a really horrific institution that was just, the conditions were indescribably atrocious for children. And that sort of set in motion some changes to the laws to allow more independence. But again, this was it established fear of disabled people and a sense that they did not belong in society. You look at schools. Schools are very segregated to this day. Special education classes keep people from ever having regular interactions with many disabled people, often throughout their lives. So again, it's something people are taught to be ashamed of, afraid of, and unfamiliar with. That means that it's not surprising that people don't think we exist, and also don't think about us as they design buildings, structures, products, spaces in general. When we are talking about the idea of physical exclusion in public spaces and access to locations in everything from game stores to conventions, which you look at the world right now, and that's conventions are not happening for our community at all. Who is allowed to participate fully? It's a very different experience for the disabled community. So on Tuesday, it was the 32nd anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But here's an example of what our world looks like with that. There is still a massive lack of compliance. So we're going to look at New York really quickly. As of June 23rd of this year, the MTA, the Metro Transit Authority in New York, made an agreement to make 95% of the currently inaccessible stations accessible. So there are currently 364 inaccessible stations in New York. There are 131 accessible stations, frequently with broken elevators, lack of information about closures or rerouting. So they've agreed to make 95% of those 364 stations accessible, which is fantastic, by 2055. So we are looking at 65 years after the ADA passed. And it took several lawsuits to even get to that point. This is not immediate action. So you're talking about who can even get to a location. Is there parking? Is there a restroom that's usable? Just one step up is not sufficient. That is not access. Is there linguistic access? This is a community that has been very much historically excised from equal participation in society. So games are an amazing outlet. They are something that can be done from home. They're something that can be done from bed. They can be done with breaks. They can be done with time frames. They can be done with conversation around what people need. It's an incredible opportunity for a community that has not had equal participation. But if you aren't taking into account whether or not spaces are accessible, you don't have equity of opportunity to participate in a physical manner. So that's some of the physical spaces ideas. Similarly, social access, content access. Is the material available in accessible formats? Are the books available in large format, Braille? Is there a way to approach things that have complex math if you're looking at educational access? Is there an audiobook version for folks who might have dyslexia? Financial access. When you're talking about the disabled community, SSI at its max has, I believe, I have it written down somewhere, but the max is around, it's less than $800, I believe, a month. So disposable income when you are on SSI is non-existent. Living expenses are incredibly high. So is there a way to access those materials? What do you need to play? Those are all things that need to be factored into who is even allowed to begin to play these games. Is there temperature control? Is there safety with masking? Are there adequate outlets? Is there flexibility in terms of scheduling and participation, what we like to call CRIP time? CRIP is a reclaimed word. I will probably talk about a number of different slurs. Cripple is not an okay word in general, and crippled, which is a word that is often used as a status effect in games, is a pretty inappropriate term. It's also a non-specific, inaccurate term. But CRIP has been reclaimed as a term within the community. Are there decompression spaces? Is there sensory equity, fragrances, fragrance-free for allergies, food safety in terms of not having allergens around? If you're in virtual spaces, is there captioning? Is there interpretation available? Are you allowing assistive devices? And are those devices compatible with whatever systems you're using? We have seen improvement. Accessible materials have improved in the last few years, with more and more materials being put into PDFs, being put online, and with more conversation about accessible materials. But it still is not consistent. And so really trying to cross-reference those things as you're thinking about who can access these materials is really important. Some ideas for physical access needs are things like regular breaks every hour and a half to 2 hours, having an open table where people can get up, walk away if they need to, come back, stim if they need to stim, having safety tools in place, working on having recaps and notes available, multiple modalities of games. So finding out what works for people, if they need visual cues, if they need auditory cues, if those things are distracting and making things more difficult, allowing repetition without shame. So if someone needs to ask you to repeat something, allowing snacking, fidgeting, stim toys, turning off distracting lighting and sound. Quiet cards, if the table noise becomes too distracting. If you're using things like X cards at your table, you can use a quiet card as well, which someone holds up, and it basically just says everyone just needs to kind of be quiet for a minute and give everything a moment to decompress. And allowing people to finish their statements, particularly if you're dealing with language disabilities and communication disabilities. Those are certainly things to really think about right off the bat. So let's talk now about who is allowed in the game worlds. Who's allowed to exist in these worlds, in these cultures? What characters can you play? What NPCs exist? Are worlds accessible? This is where tropes really come into play. Good representation is rare with disability. Disabled characters are often reduced to caricatures. In terms of representation, 3.1% of 2020 television characters were disabled, mostly played by non-disabled actors.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
3.1% of television characters in 2020 were disabled. Most were played by non-disabled actors. Most of the representation is of straight, cis, white, male wheelchair users. I have also noticed a recent trend of the autistic best friend. It's very rare that you have a leading character who is disabled. It's very rare that you have a romantic interest who is disabled. Stereotypes reinforce fears. They reinforce internalized ableism, which is something more and more people are having to reckon with as we're talking about things like long COVID. They influence perception of characters in the real world, perception of people in the real world, rather. Some tropes to sort of be aware of. Inspiration porn. This is a term that was coined by Stella Young. If you take one thing away from this whole conversation, please go watch Stella Young's TED Talk. It is called I Am Not Your Inspiration. Thank you very much. It is 9 minutes long. It is the best introduction to disability justice that you will find. But the term is used to refer to making non-disabled people feel good or better about themselves by using disabled people as a tool of inspiration. The idea behind it is if this person can do it, why can't you? Ideas around overcoming. It's very tied to the medical model of look at them, they're working against this deficit, and you, a person who has no deficit because you are a normative person, should be able to achieve these things. It has assumptions of inferiority rather than difference, and an implication of pity. Emily Ladau, Ladau, created some classifications of subtypes of inspiration porn. Overcoming adversity. The only disability is a bad attitude. It ignores the need for access and accommodation. Life's moments, which is the disabled person who gets up and walks down the aisle out of their wheelchair. And it's the idea that being disabled means you can't live a full life, that you are denied a full life with your existence. So achieving these things that are seen as, normal milestones becomes an inspirational thing. The Great Expectations, which is you must be, it's finishing first. You have to be an amazing or it's a tragedy. And then Not Your Good Deed, which is like the asking someone to homecoming. Basically, the best way to evaluate this is to say, if this was about a non-disabled person, would I have the same reaction? And then the inverse of that is the pity porn. It's the Jerry's Kids. It's the tragedy of acquired disability. And then the most horrific of these is the better dead than disabled trope. It's the I am either I will sacrifice my life because I am disabled and my life continuing is so horrific, or just there is nothing in the future for me. And the sacrifice is usually is almost universally for the benefit of a non-disabled person. So examples of that are things like Me Before You or $1 Million Baby. Things like stigmatizing mental illness, so sensationalizing, mental health crises. It makes it dangerous. It makes it scary. This is particularly pernicious around violence. When we're talking about mass shootings, things like that, it's almost always, well, they were mentally ill. The reality is no, people with mental illness are much more likely to be the victims of violence than they are the perpetrators. And it's also frequently now being applied to things like racism and bigotry. Those are not mental illnesses. That is a conscious choice, and I apologize for the sirens. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind as you start to design villains in worlds. When we're talking about villainy, the ideas around abomination, around monstrosity, around freaks, this goes back to who was allowed to be exhibited in the ugly law eras, among other things. But villains are so frequently depicted as having scarring, facial or limb difference. I mean, you just look at the Bond films and every villain has some sort of facial difference or limb difference or, you know. So when you're talking about fantasy worlds, frequently you see the monstrous villain, and often you are seeing them coming through with a deep-seated anger and rage about their existence, and a desire for retaliation about their existence. And that trope is just so deeply problematic. And then also the ideas around sex and relationships that disabled people don't have partnerships, families, things like that. Or the depictions we get are very voyeuristic. We also get the henchman tropes. So there's often a lot of physical difference there. Also, intelligence is used as a metric often. Ideas around intelligence, when you think about a lot of the terminology we use within intelligence, those are all disability slurs. Stupid, dumb, which is hits two different disabled communities because it came out of the non-speaking and deaf community, and then was interpreted to be a question of intellectual disability. So when you're talking about intelligence in game worlds, thinking about intelligence as book learning rather than capacity for knowledge is a really great metric to try and adjust to. This also brings us into the ideas of magical cures, which is the overcoming, you must overcome a disability to be happy. It is your motivation to go on a quest. That's complete erasure of the fact that many disabled people have very happy lives and are very comfortable with their brains and bodies and don't really want, don't believe in being fixed. Again, this is very much a medicalization of a normative body idea. It's part of identity and often has a deep sense of community ties. So magical cures it's not something that really needs to be part of that vocabulary and that motivating factor. Certainly if you have a curse, it's one thing. If you have a character who in the course of a story gets cursed, that's a little bit different. But also, I think there's also opportunity in telling narratives about recognizing a change in your existence as part of your life as an adventurer, and how do you navigate the world with these different needs and tools. You know, disabled worth is not tied to non-disabled acceptance. People say, don't let your disability define you, but the reality is we are defined in countless ways by our disabilities, both visibly and invisibly. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's how we navigate the world. And that can be an asset. Disabled people are incredible planners. We think about the world planning for every possibility. You know, you want a disabled person on your team for an adventure because they have a plan A, plan B, plan C, all the way through plan Z, and then they have plans numbered 1 to 200 just in their back pocket, just in case. So I think those are all things to be thinking about. Keeping in mind too that devices and you know, accessibility aids in world don't need to be magical erasure. Often you'll have what we call the super crip trope, which is someone like Daredevil, who even though Daredevil is blind, he doesn't navigate the world as a blind person. He has this magical sense that allows him to navigate as a sighted person through the world. It's very different. Elsa Hunnesson, that's SJUNNESSON, who wrote a phenomenal book called Being Seen, talks about how Toph from Avatar is a really great example of a blind character who doesn't have the supercrypt thing because she uses her other senses in a way that is pretty in line with how blind people navigate the world using other senses. You know, feeling vibrations with your feet makes sense as an actual way to navigate. She's not using that to navigate the world as a sighted person. But the difference between those two characters is pretty stark. But, you know, a prosthetic that negates an amputation isn't realistic. Prosthetics don't give you that manual dexterity in the same way. They're going to be open and close, and not a lot of pressure control. One of the big ones I get a lot when I'm consulting is wheelchair design. I so often will get people who get very excited about the idea of having really cool looking fantasy wheelchairs. Oh, it can fly. Oh, it can have all these weapons and things. And the reality is I'll get the art for them and they won't fit through the door. And I'm going, this is really cool, but the reality is this is not serving its basic function as an accessibility device. This is not something anyone could realistically use. Not that we're needing a simulation of reality, but if your basic elemental function as a device is not working, it's why would anyone use that? You'd be better off just assembling a wagon wheel on a regular chair. So I think really asking first and foremost, does this serve the purpose that that disabled people need? And there's something, a term that was coined called a disabled dongle. This is a term for the inventions that often design students create for disabled people without ever having our input. For these kind of cure-alls, this is stair climbing wheelchairs or ASL interpreting gloves. And the reality is those for many reasons are not functional in our lives. So having magical disability dongles is not what we're looking for. We're looking for things that are actually tools to allow equal access in the world. But when you're building those worlds, also think about building in accessibility, because in imagination, it's the place that it doesn't cost anything to create a ramp or an elevator or a teleportation circle or an auditory cue or a textured crosswalk. You don't have to get permits. You don't have to get, architectural plans. You can just imagine it and have your world be accessible, rather than building in inaccessibility. And when you think about a city that has to be usable by both giants and gnomes, one is accessible for the other. How? You have places that are designed to be operated by people who have 6 arms. How is that going to work with someone who has 1 arm or no arms? And so taking those things into consideration as well. There's also a term called narrative prosthesis, which is the idea of disability being symbolic of morality, a lesson someone needs to learn. So as you're creating these characters, getting rid of those ideas and just allowing people to be disabled in the world and part of the world and having jobs and families and motivations outside of their disability is so important. So how is this changing? Like I said, Candlekeep was written by a number of disabled authors. Several of the books since have had several disabled authors and multiply marginalized authors involved. We have had disabled characters on several of the books. As we get more into kind of who is writing these stories, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but There was a wheelchair using named character in one of the recent books for D&D. The Fate Accessibility Toolkit, which I see someone put up in the Discord chat. It's one of my favorite things that's been put out. It is phenomenal. They are slowly, many games are slowly moving away from madness mechanics and other sanist mechanics, getting away from conditions like blindness and deafness as status effects, which, keep in mind, those are not binary conditions either. So if you say, I'm imposing blindness, what does that mean? What degree of vision does that person potentially still have? And is it someone who might be comfortable without sight? Is there a place where that might be an asset in the world? So think about making your worlds accessible from the jump, from the get-go, and you'll have a much easier time of creating these worlds. But also keep in mind, these devices and tools can be beautiful, and it can be part of identity, and it can be a means of self-expression. These don't have to be clinical, medicalized things. We name our devices, we name our wheelchairs and our canes and our crutches. We put rhinestones on our hearing aids. You know, these are expressions of identity. So that brings us, and I'm trying to keep an eye on the time, to who is creating these worlds. Historically, there have not been a ton of openly disabled tabletop designers. That is changing. There are now several disabled team members on staff at WotC, and at a number of other different game companies. People are also coming forward about their disabilities more often. Consultants are becoming more common in these discussions. These developments are in concert and dialogue with, but also because of pressure from the community. So there's this very interesting feedback loop of community driving change. There are, I mentioned that already. But I wanted to drive home also the importance of having a disabled team throughout involved, because if you only bring people in early on in the process, when you get to editing, often you will have an editor who isn't familiar with the fact that terms like dumb and lame are slurs, that they're not acceptable terms in the disabled community, and those may get peppered in. They might miss intentional design choices that are made. Like any other marginalized community, there are subtleties that are put in by creatives that can get missed in the process if you don't have someone involved throughout with that awareness. So having someone involved throughout is really important in the beginning, the middle, and the end in terms of conceptualization and authenticity. But it's also important to make sure that you aren't just bringing on consultants. Consulting is a complex situation to begin with, but it's often used as a way to protect companies and products from having to actually hire disabled creatives. But I think when you bring on disabled creatives, you are going to see, what I see when I work with teams is there's always a moment where the light bulb goes off and they go, there are so many stories here. Like how has no one told these stories? There's so much here. It's such a rich world. And I think that often gets missed when you just have someone for a couple of hours throughout the process. One example is we were deeply involved in the process with Clementine. And there is a scene that I am so proud of. I was not the only consultant on it. Clementine is a queer Black woman who has become disabled throughout the course of her story. And so it was important to me that I was not the only person in that room as a white person. So I made sure we had multiple people involved, and that I am also not an amputee, and talking about things like prosthetic fittings, it was important to have those people in the room. And so in conversation with Tilly Walden, TillieWalden, who was the author and the illustrator, we ended up landing on this really beautiful scene of Clem getting a prosthetic fitting. I have never seen anything like it before in any media, and it never would have happened without having the conversation of multiple disabled people talking about their experiences. And I'm so unbelievably proud of that moment. But there are obstacles to this. Most of the work in game design is freelance. Freelance means no health insurance. Freelance doesn't mean a steady income. And for disabled people, those are huge concerns. Also, schedules and deadlines can be issues. So the ways we have to approach this are really taking those things into consideration in the planning stages, and making sure that we are building in time for flexibility, that we are finding places where there can be flexibility in the process, that we are talking to people and asking about what their access needs are, but also that we are not just bringing people on and setting them up to fail. Because if you set people up to fail, then it becomes that systemic reinforcement of, oh, well, they're not, this is why we don't hire, insert whatever marginalized group here. But the failure is because people have been put in positions where they cannot succeed. So always it should be building toward these sustainable systems, whether that means we're talking about things like unionization or standardized freelancer rates, or we're talking about going full time and bringing people onto staff and ensuring that there is equity of opportunity and benefits there. So those certainly are a few of the things that I think really need to be taken into consideration in this process. Obviously, there is so much more to talk about in terms of tools and resources and things, physical dice and other mechanisms to have at the table. But I kind of want to wrap up so we have a little bit of time for questions, hopefully. But the key takeaways I want people to take away are that, this really can be a beautiful thing. It can be an important community and an important piece of identity, and something that many of us are really proud of, and that it shouldn't be something that's shameful. Disabled isn't a bad word. It's a descriptor, and it's an appropriate descriptor. For most of us, it has become something that has been, especially in the last few years, foundational to our identities and our survival. Mutual aid and the systems we had in place. Alice Wong calls us oracles, because we have had these systems in place because we had to. So as the world at large had to adjust, we really were prepared for that in ways that I think the non-disabled community wasn't. But we are also often ignored in those conversations, and eugenics doesn't go away. You have, the CDC director saying that our deaths are reassuring. Erasure in imagination is eugenics. When you are saying that a group of people does not exist in your idealized worlds, you are saying something about people in the real world. And those communities deserve to exist, and have stories told about them with all of the nuance and care and complexity that anyone else does, and deserve to see themselves represented in those worlds. And that disability can be an asset. There is creativity and untapped potential in the disabled community, in terms of creativity, imagination, strategy, problem solving. But the process is different than the process that non-disabled people may be used to. So exploring that and being open to those discussions creates those spaces. Access is essential, and really putting a focus back onto it makes a better game for everyone. And go watch Stella Young's TED Talk. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Yes, like virtual digital applause erupts. I know you've been kind of, had your eye on the Discord. People have just been, effusive in the conversations that are happening and their praise of you. If folks do have specific questions that they'd like, we do have the Q&A happening. So Brandon Blackburn writes, I loved your point about fear. One of my favorite sayings is that equity, equality can feel like oppression to people with privilege. A lot of resistance to accessibility accommodations comes from this latter group's unfounded fear of a zero-sum game in which making something more accessible for someone else will make it less accessible for them. How do you think we should approach and combat this false narrative?
It's a complex issue, certainly. And a lot of it has to do with a longer term process of exposure and getting those conversations into a more public space and seeing more disabled people and recognizing that those changes are, not the things people are afraid of. But, I think when you lay out the fact that disabled communities don't have marriage equality, you can't get married if you're on SSI because it puts you over the financial limit. You can't have a fridge that you share with roommates because it's seen as a financial gift if you eat your roommate's food. People talk about, they often will make the same kind of comments about disability that they do about welfare. And when you show them the numbers, when you say it's $800 a month, how is that, what do you think this is? When you talk about the fact that a wheelchair user gets harassed if they are ambulatory and walk, when you really show what the day-to-day life looks like, I think there is a different sense of recognition and understanding. But I also think that you're going to see fewer people who can insulate themselves from disability in the world we live in at this point. I think it's going to be much harder to say, I don't know anyone, when you have more than 20% of people who get COVID ending up with some variant of long COVID. It gets much harder to dismiss MECFS as something people are inventing as an excuse to not have to do things when your best friend has it now.
They just don't want to work, Jennifer. That's what's happening.
It's completely, yeah, it's laziness. Because, it's really fun to lie in bed and not be able to lift your head up. That's the experience. I think when people can see these things for what they are and have an understanding of it, it's much harder to create these caricatures. But again, you have to dismantle these stereotypes around it as well. And pointing out to people, what else counts as disability? Pregnancy can be disability. Addiction is disability. Cancer is disability. So many different things are disability that people don't recognize, but also there are these protections that are there for you should you need them as well. So yeah, it's I think a lot of it is conversation and education and interaction. but
Yeah, and
always that's easier said than done.
right, of course. And I like your emphasis on the kind of breaking down these binaries, because I think you're right. Of too often people are like, well, you're either disabled or you're not disabled. And I have a preconceived notion of what that means, right? And what that looks like. And you're not fitting that box, you're not checking off that box. And so therefore you must be fine.
Yeah.
Or you must be completely can't do anything, right?
Right.
Because there is no kind of gray scale. And
Mhm.
you would think that with 1 out of 4 or more people having a disability in some fashion, whether visible or invisible, that those kinds of conversations would be more prevalent, that those kinds of stereotypes would be broken. But again, we keep kind of going back to these awful tropes, and we keep retelling the same stories by people who aren't actually experiencing what we're talking about, unfortunately.
Yeah, we've also divested aging, and everything that comes along with aging, it overlaps with disability and is disability, but people don't think of those things as being the same.
Yeah.
And I think so, removing some of that stigma as well is part of that conversation too.
Yeah. So we have another question in the Q&A that says, the combat wheelchair, do you have any idea if and when this will become official? And if Sarah Thompson, who invented the combat wheelchair and is doing amazing things, please follow her on Twitter, will be recognized there as its creator. Did it get used in the wheelchair accessible adventure that you mentioned in the Candlekeep Mysteries?
Yeah, so I certainly cannot speak for Wizards of the Coast. I mean, obviously Sarah has published the combat wheelchair, so it is published and out there, and available. It is compatible with my adventure in Candlekeep. I think Sarah has done a brilliant job. I think they've done incredible work on it. I also think that there are so many different ways to approach the ideas of different devices too. And so I think that, I know other people have also invented other tools. So I don't think that necessarily, the Fate Accessibility Toolkit has a number of different approaches to chairs. In Starfinder, we have a hover chair. So I think there are a lot of different devices out there that people are working with. In terms, I mean, Sarah obviously is recognized as creating those specific mechanics and publishing them, but I certainly cannot speak for Wizards of the Coast on any sort of, I don't, that's above my pay grade.
That's understandable. That's okay. Are there other questions or just comments that people would like to make? I think so. I don't know if you go back into the Discord, there was a good silence there for like 15 minutes. And then I think Aaron posted like, oh, wait, I forgot I should be checking this, because we were just all so engrossed in what you were talking about that we were like, oh, right, this is other space that we could be going to and having a conversation. And then people started to post various resources and things that kind of went along with as you were talking. But yeah, it's been fun.
Oh yeah, I see someone mentioning 6 Ways of Looking at Crypt Time. It's a phenomenal essay. It's also in Disability Visibility, which is Alice Wong's collection. That's phenomenal. Yeah, Evan, I mean, that certainly the discussion about the American context is important, 100%. And that is why I wanted to really point out that I was speaking, almost exclusively from a US centric point of view. There are definitely things happening internationally, and the access varies by location, but the ADA has provided equal access in terms of public events in theory. So I also want to point out that the ADA does not have an enforcement body. I think people often say, oh, just, slap an ADA suit on it and it's fine. That's not how this works. There is no one enforcing it. It has to be, the onus is on disabled people to flag something. And often there is a window of repair that occurs before you can even process any sort of suit. So it's not like the ADA shows up in their cape and like fixes the things. Often it is a set of laws that don't have a lot of teeth. See 65 years before we get accessible subway stations in New York. So
Aaron, did you want to comment?
Yeah. First, thank you, Jennifer. This was such an amazing talk. I'm already thinking like 100 people I want to forward it to once we get the video up. And also, I just want to acknowledge how hard it must have been to say so much of that. I was getting worked up and cheerful during the talk because I was feeling you in a lot of ways. I think my question is, because you've been so successful, like your story with Candlekeep, right? Like getting WotC to have this stages intervention. That's really amazing. And it like really speaks, I think, to your savvy. So I guess my question is like, how do you get people to listen? And I'm curious because I think that's an important thing that we're all trying to do in different spaces at different times.
yeah, that's a tough one. Some of it is certainly privilege. I am, because my disabilities are invisible, for the most part. For a lot of non-disabled people, that is a lot less intimidating. It is a lot less threatening. I'm also white. I'm also, have a degree of means. Like these are all privileges that I have that allow me to have these conversations where someone who was multiply marginalized might not have those opportunities, or someone who had a more visible disability, or something that was more, prohibitive in terms of certain types of communication. It's also been a long process for me. I also got to come at it from having a career in ways that were valuable to apply to what I was talking about, which is sort of capitalism rearing its ugly head in those discussions. But also, I think we all want change fast. And the reality is, when we're talking about especially these larger organizations and these larger structures, we're turning big aircraft carriers. It's much easier to steer a schooner than it is to turn an aircraft carrier. This is a long, slow, committed progress. Some of it is working within systems, which is not always ideal. Some of it is knowing how to call people, I guess it's calling people in, rather than calling them out, and not only asking for that accountability, but also offering solutions and strategies. It's also a lot of free work, unpaid labor, emotional work. Yeah, I mean, this has been the last half decade of my life to get things. And obviously it's not just me doing this, and without the demand of an audience, there wouldn't be the change that we're seeing. But I also think there is value in just people making things that are undeniable. And it sucks to have marginalized people held to a different standard. But the reality is, unless you can be undeniable, often your failures will get excused as the failures of an entire category of people rather than your own individual inexperience or lack of mentorship or, whatever it is. For me, though, it's also mentorship is key. It's bringing people along. It is recommending people. It is creating these ways to uplift other marginalized and multiply marginalized voices, and using the privilege that I have to ensure that other voices are in the room. I can go say, hey, I am not the consultant you need on this, or we need these additional people here because it's not right for me to try and have this discussion. Yeah, I mean, what Mark Wade said something about breaking into, I think he was specifically talking about comics, but I think it's applicable to most industries, most creative industries, at least. He said it's like breaking out of prison. You can only do it once and then they close the way up behind you. I think we all have individual pathways to this stuff, but the hope is just to move the needle a little bit. I'm not going to be able to revolutionize this thing by myself, and nor would I want to be the only person to make those changes. This has to be for everybody and with the input of everyone who is part of this community. So I don't know if that made any sense at all. I feel like I rambled.
You did not. It was lovely. I'm sorry, Erin.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you.
But it's using the systems and also working outside the systems.
Yeah. And unfortunately, right. I mean, when the system is, we might get somewhat accessible in 50 years, you can't just rely on within the system, right? Like you have to Han Solo this up.
And when you can point to something like the Fate Accessibility Kit, or you can show the difference that captioning makes to a stream and to the viewership of it, you have people recognizing universal access being a good thing, getting that positive feedback. That's something you can then take to the decision makers. And you can say, look, this has a positive impact. You're going to get positive feedback. And when you don't have that, this is the alternative. You've seen it, or you aren't getting this business that you could have. I mean, sometimes it does come down to dollars and cents. It's why I have those numbers in my back pocket for those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, taking multiple rhetorical approaches makes sense. I mean, because you don't know which one's going to stick, even though they all should land, right? Even though it shouldn't have to come down to that. It should just come down to, hey, these are people and this is the right thing to do. And yet somehow it still has to come down to dollars. Are there, oh man, I don't want to end on such a terrible note.
I mean,
that is not the takeaway, y'all.
The takeaway is things are changing.
Yeah.
The Fate Accessibility Toolkit is nominated for an Emmy. We are looking at having multiple streams with disabled creators involved. We have numerous books. We have non-speaking characters in official adventures. There is a whole movement to improve access to make sure that D&D Beyond is screen reader compatible. These are conversations that weren't happening 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. That's a change, and that's an improvement, and we're not done yet. And I'll give one final anecdote, which is I worked with a wonderful game designer named James Hudson. And I consulted on a tabletop game, a board game with him. And I've been working with him on a new game and doing design on a wheelchair user in that game. But he sent me something recently that his team had sent to him that included disabled characters. And he said, I didn't have to ask for this. They did this on their own because we had had the conversation and they understood. And now it's part of the standard operating procedure. That's one person, and that conversation has now spread to the whole team. To me, that's big progress, and certainly moving us in a much more inclusive, accessible direction, in a way that we absolutely would not have been moving if these conversations weren't happening, and people like, Alice Wong and Elsa and so many incredible activists and scholars and designers weren't putting in the work to make sure these conversations were foregrounded. So that's massive to me.
It absolutely is. So I think part of the takeaway is it is changing. Be patient, but don't stop advocating and don't stop having these conversations, right? And add more to these conversations like we're doing here. And I think on that, I think we will end. Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was remarkable. Thank you for the folks who have continue to be here for Generation Analog 2022. We are so thrilled with how this event went, and thank you again, Jennifer. This was a remarkable conversation that again, if we will go back to the Discord and continue these kinds of conversations, and if you do have slides you want to share or other resources, that Discord will continue to be up and folks can continue to check that out. So yes, a round of applause once more for Jennifer. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.